Since I started my channel, I think I probably read around 50 series, or at least read the first book in around 50 series, or a bit more than 300 books in total. And while I constantly discover new amazing pieces of literature, I do think that I might have discovered a new series that not only has become a total new favorite of mine, but I truly think it might be one of the most underrated series I have ever read. But it is also a series I think is incredibly hard to recommend to a wide audience. That is the Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. So in this video, I want to go through why I think this series is absolutely incredible. And then at the end of this video, I'll come to some points of why I think a lot of people will not enjoy this series as well. Oh, and also this will be 100% spoiler free. So what is the Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu? Well, it is a 4-book series spanning around 4,000 pages. So yes, each book is seriously long, especially book 3 and 4. And it's one of those series that is hard to describe in a few sentences, because this is not a series that is about one single thing. No, rather it is a multi-generational story of the rise and fall of kingdoms. You know, when people are struggling to describe what Malazan by Steven Erikson is? Well, it's kind of similar in this situation, albeit I do think that the Dandelion Dynasty is much more simple. But the first book, The Grace of Kings, is probably going to be the book that most readers will struggle with the most, due to the way Liu has structured the plot. Now, I made a full spoiler-free review for the first book. If you're interested, I'll put it up here. But what is so unique with The Grace of Kings is how much ground is covered within these pages. I mean, the plot is seriously epic and covers literally the fall of a kingdom and the struggle of setting up a new kingdom. I mean, The Grace of Kings in of its own literally could have been a 10-book series if it was written by someone else, and in a lot of ways, the way the story is told is almost like reading a history book with an additional map. It's almost like looking down on this massive map, and then the historian takes you over to the map and starts telling you a story. Now, imagine this. The story starts in a place where a person was born and rose to power. Then fast forward, and then 6 months later, this person now travels to this other place on the map and starts a rebellion, and so on and so on. And then that rebellion led to, at this other place in the world, a new rebellion starts, or a counterforce, and so on and so on. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but it really feels like when you're reading The Grace of Kings, you're looking down on this map and you see like a bunch of big events unfolding in front of your eyes. It is an absolutely fascinating way to tell a story, because it literally feels like you cover a whole series in one book. But really, what The Grace of Kings serves as is almost as this incredibly epic and beautiful prequel to a much larger story. And then we get to book 2, The Wall of Storms, which in my opinion is where the story really feels like it starts. You can almost see the series as having a prequel novel and then a primary trilogy, albeit please do not start with book 2 because you would be seriously confused. But from book 2 and onwards, this series narrative does change quite a lot, where the pacing slows down and becomes increasingly more character focused, but also where the plot becomes even larger, which almost sounds like it's not possible. Now, while I loved all 4 books in this quartet, The Wall of Storms, which is book 2, is one of the best books I have read in my life. It is absolutely mind-blowing how riveting and epic that book is, and I truly think that if you struggled with The Grace of Kings, it is still very much worth reading book 2 just to see if you'll enjoy it. Now, let's talk about world building. The Dandelion Dynasty is set in a secondary fantasy world in which heroes are engineers, not magicians, and this world blends East Asian and classical philosophies and traditions, and it spans multiple generations and continents, and it builds a new mythology from the actions of its heroes. So in a lot of ways, the world building itself is Asian inspired, but interestingly, the plot itself also has a lot of inspirations from how America was founded as a nation. Now, Ken Liu describes the setting as a silk punk fantasy, which, if I understand it correctly, it's an Eastern-inspired fantasy technological setting where we are set in a world where the nations are on the verge of making some really significant technological breakthroughs, which then also becomes a big focus of the series. The focus on invention and creating new technology and the impact it has on people's lives and political structures and society and so on. Now, while the series doesn't have an insane amount of fantastical elements, we do have chapters where we get to hear from gods in the series series, and we also get to hear the gods' thoughts on how events are unfolding in this massive world Ken-Lu has created. And then we do also have some fantastical creatures, so we don't have dragons, but we have these creatures called Garanophins, which are these flying beasts that you can ride on, and these beasts play a massive role in the politics and the culture and the history of the world. Now, there's little doubt in my mind that the Dandelion Dynasty is one of the finest series I read when it comes to building an expansive world. I mean, not only does this world feel absolutely massive, but it also feels incredibly diverse. You'll follow characters that live in large cities and small villages. You'll follow characters that have academic backgrounds and characters that are uneducated and live in rural places. The world is absolutely massive, and I think most of you will be absolutely blown away by the exciting world building in the Dandelion Dynasty. Now, I also need to mention that the battle scenes in this series are next level. Now, I'm rarely a fan of long battle scenes, but this series has multiple war scenes which literally covers both water, earth and air battles with huge armies, fantastical creatures and new technology. I mean, truly, some of the most breathtaking war scenes I've ever come across in fantasy are in this series, and I found it incredibly riveting. Now, let's talk briefly about characters. And this again, it'll be totally spoiler free, so I won't even really mention any names, but I think that Ken Slu's approach to how he structures the plot makes for some really fascinating and interesting character arcs. One thing that is really interesting is how much care Ken Lu will often take to flesh out characters, and then literally some chapters later he'll probably kill them off. Now, the fact that we don't know if our characters will survive does create a lot of uncertainty, but it also makes the plot feel so much more realistic. But it also did lead to a situation where sometimes I became a bit more careful of getting too attached to some characters due to me not really knowing if this character might actually be killed off a couple of chapters later. And that is especially the case for The Grace of Kings, which is book 1 in this series. But the real interesting thing here is the amount of character arcs you'll encounter in the series. Now, since the Dandelion Dynasty takes places over multiple generations, you get to see several characters go from youth to death, which is not often something you see in fantasy. Secondly, since the story covers such a long time frame, and you've been told story of how the Empire has developed, you understand so much better the burden of some of the characters and the legacy they carry in book 3 and 4. Like, you will remember the action and life of the characters in book 1, which will make you appreciate the conflicts and the internal turmoil of the new characters in book 3 ever so much more. Also, generally, I just think that Ken Lu's characterization is some of the best I've come across in the genre. One of the highlights of this series is how Ken Lu explores themes. I mean, truly, I think this might be the most impactful series I have read ever in terms of exploring themes and messages, due to the themes often being explored over generations and in various areas of this massive world. Now, themes such as human depravity, corruption of power, the political challenges of new technology, the complex nature of legacy and culture, the yearning for power and domination, and the near impossible task of implementing a fair political structure, unity, food, yes, food is important in the series, religion, and so on are absolutely massively handled. Now, some authors will often be very obvious with their messaging or themes, but I found the discussion and the exploration of the themes to be incredibly nuanced and thought-provoking. And I know I keep repeating myself, but it is particularly due to a lot of these themes being explored over generations in different cultures and through different characters that give you that experience of nuance and appreciation of different areas of themes or potential conflicts we have in this series. Now, it should be clear by now that I think that the Dandelion Dynasty is not only one of the best series I have ever read, but I also think that it is criminally underrated in the fantasy genre. I mean, I think Ken Lu is not only a good writer, but he is incredibly smart. But why do I still find this series hard to recommend to a large audience? Well, let's get into it. Firstly, while I adore The Grace of Kings, book 1 in the series, I think it is a book I probably wouldn't have enjoyed if I picked it up 3 years ago. I mean, the narrative and the structure of the plot is so unique, and in a lot of ways, it feels more like reading a history book than a fantasy novel. In a lot of ways, the Dandelion Dynasty is the opposite of stories that are popular on booktube, such as the Farsi trilogy or Mistborn, which are incredibly character driven. I mean, we don't really have one protagonist or one singular plotline that is very easy to follow. Rather, the Dandelion Dynasty is a multi-generational story that tells you a story of an empire rather than one person, and I think a lot of readers will struggle with that. Secondly, Ken Liu, he loves going on random tangents where he explores the gods or the technology or the culture or the Garnaffins, and will do it occasionally in flashbacks or by introducing new characters. And while all of those things are very, very fascinating, it does occasionally feel like a bit random, which I think some readers might not appreciate, because he will often use lots and lots of pages exploring some themes or world building mechanics in this world. Now, I think when you look at the series as a whole, these so-called tangents are justified because they do add something to the world or the exploration of themes, but that is one area I can see some people will struggle, especially considering that this series is so long. Which brings me to the third point, the length of this series. I mean, specifically book 3 and 4. Now, I will state that I think that Ken Liu concluded this series in a perfect way, which is ridiculously impressive considering the scope of the series. That being said, The Whale Throne and Speaking Bones, book 3 and 4, could potentially have been a bit shorter. I mean, Speaking Bones is a whopping 1,280 pages on Kindle, and it can occasionally drag. While The Whale Throne, book 3, at the conclusion of that book, we have a cooking competition. Yes, the whole build-up in book 3 leads to people cooking food in a competition, and the competition goes on for ages. Now, I loved it because I found it so unique and refreshing, but I do think that some readers will find the length and the pacing to be a bit of a struggle. Now, fourth and lastly, if you are a character reader, then you might not love this series. I've stated it multiple times in this review already, but the characters in the series are incredible, but there are a lot of them, and you will see a lot of them die due to how big the time span is in the series. But yes, the Dandelion Dynasty is, in my opinion, one of the finest pieces of fantasy literature, or just literature, I've ever come across. It is incredibly ambitious, it's epic, it's beautiful, but it is also a very demanding reading experience that will definitely not be for everyone. Nonetheless, I hope many of you will pick up the series because Ken Liu truly deserves more love on booktube. I gave The Grace of Kings 4.5 stars, The Wall of Storms 5 stars, The Wheel Throne 4 stars, and Speaking Bones 4.5 stars, which definitely makes this one of my all-time favorite series and will probably sneak into my top 3 at this point. And if you want a more in-depth review of The Grace of Kings, then check out this video. Thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. Now, if you want to support what I do here, then I do have a Patreon. Now, a reason why I created a Patreon was to find a new way to reinvest to the channel, because basically since I created my Patreon, I spent around 100% of my earnings to hire an editor to do a couple of videos for me a month. Now, since creating my Patreon, an editor has done more than 20 videos for me on my channel, so it makes a huge difference. Now, if you join my Patreon, you will also get some benefits. For example, you'll get a name in my videos like these guys. You'll also be able to join the exclusive Viking book club where every month we read one book together, and you might be the one to put the book forward. This month we're reading this book, and next month we're reading this book. You also get to vote on my next read, get access to exclusive videos like a wrap-up or even book reviews, and so much more. But this is totally voluntary, but all support is much appreciated.